Hey guys, welcome to week 2 of our part-time adventure into the back-end land of JavaScript development. So last week you guys learned the critical basics. You learned how to set up a basic Express server in Node, and you learned how to write CRUD operations. And it turns out that that's actually a really huge part of the battle. So this week is in many ways just an opportunity to practice those skills and go a little bit deeper. So for tonight, we really have 2 topics we're going to talk about. The first is how to set up a Node repo from scratch. So we do this nice little thing where we hand you a kind of prefabbed repo that has everything set up nicely for you, and all you have to do is install and run start, and everything's great. And that's nice, but I know that when I was in a coding immersive myself, had this experience of feeling like I really understood it. And then when I went to do it myself, realized that I didn't even know the basics of how do I get my, package.json there and things like that. So we're going to start with that. We're going to start by building a repo from scratch, which is going to be also our way to talk about all these little things that make our repositories run and what they are and why they work. And then the second topic for tonight, which is more the topic that's highlighted in Training Kit, is middleware. So we learned about Express last week, and one of the great things about Express is that it's super lightweight. But if we want our Express apps to do interesting and sometimes sophisticated things, we will need middleware. So we will explore that tonight, and then on the homework, you'll have an opportunity to practice a bit more of what you worked on last week and also to implement some of the stuff that we're learning tonight. So my first question for you guys is, how did last week go? What were the most interesting parts? What were the most confusing parts? Just a little sampling of how you guys are doing with all of this. Feel free to share your thoughts and woes and joys in Slack. And this was mentioned in Slack already, but we're not doing a questions thread tonight. Just try and put the question icon next to your question so that they pop out a little more. And I'll try and make sure that I get to those before they get buried in the fray. I'm hearing a variety of responses. One person mentioned that she was a little tripped up by puts are tricky. They are definitely tricky. I will just say to that, it's just going to take some practice. There's something else that someone brought up that I wanted to talk about already, which is this idea that shifting from front end to back end is an adjustment. So that is the next thing I wanted to ask you guys, which I think at this point we're all pretty clear on what the difference is from front end to back. Front end deals with the client and the visual stuff and clicking and typing and submitting and all that, whereas back end handles the requests behind the scene, and we're going to get into the database as well. But my question for you guys is, from your perspective as developers, now that you've coded both front end and back end, what's different? What perspective shift do you have to make? What questions do you find yourself having to ask that you weren't asking before? What's harder? What's easier? So I'm curious to hear, and what's the same? I'm curious to hear your guys' impression of, now that you've had a full week in backend, what do you see as the big differences, the challenges of each? No CSS is a big pro. I couldn't agree with you more on that one. Yes, those put requests can be beasts, but at least we won't have to be writing any CSS. Just waiting for a couple more people to send their responses. I really like that this came up. So on front end, you can visually see a flaw, but it's harder to track down bugs in the back end. Yeah, so it's really important that we're using Postman for exactly that reason. And I will say, if it were up to me, we'd be doing testing from week 1. We'll talk about testing at the end of this, but I would highly encourage you, once we go over the testing section, to start implementing that, because tests are important, but they're really important in the back end because, as Abigail said, you can't see bugs in the same way that you can. This response and request, or the request versus response, right? We're used to, from a front end perspective, we're used to knowing what the request is, but not being sure what the response might be. It's the exact opposite now. So from the front end, we're sending something out and then we see what comes back. And now it's the opposite. We get something in and we have to figure out how to react and what to send back. The shift between wondering how things will display versus what will display. That's a great insight. We don't have to think about the clients anymore. I mean, in a sense we do, but maybe this is why I like the back end so much, is we're really a lot less concerned with the user. From the front end, the number one person we're serving is the user. We have to make sure that what we're creating is going to be easy and intuitive and visually appealing. Now we're more interested definitely in serving our front-end developer. So we need to provide good, clear information for them, and also just concerned with writing clear code that makes sense to our fellow developers. It's a lot easier, I think, to fall into, promise hell or callback hell in the back end. So now we're more concerned with our fellow developers than with the user per se. All right. I think I will call it there so that we can get into the lesson, but those were all really great answers. I think that it's really important to think about these perspective shifts and to talk about them with each other or with yourselves in the mirror or with your friends and family who don't want to hear about coding but probably have to anyways. Just being able to voice and articulate what these differences are will help you get surer footing in this back-end world. All right. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and then we will start to build ourselves a new repo from scratch. 1 second. All right. Cool. So step 1 is we need to have our terminal open. So what's really nice about VS Code is it has a built-in terminal, but if we're starting purely from scratch, then we probably need to just start in our terminal. So the basic first step of creating a brand new repository is going to be to make a directory. So go ahead and do that. I will call this middleware. Make sure you're in a file you want to be in. I'm in my Lambda projects folder, so that's a good place to start. So let's go ahead and make that directory. And then, of course, we have to cd on into it. So we are now in an empty folder called middleware, but this folder will soon be home to all sorts of fun code. So the next step is going to be to initialize this using Git, because we want to make sure that this thing is Gitable so that we can, be saving and pushing and collaborating on it. So we'll use the commands git and init. So now we've created an empty Git repository in here. So that is really the biggest starting points. And then you could always open up VS Code and do this manually, but just to practice a little more with the command line, I'm going to go ahead and just create this git ignore file. We want to make sure we have a git ignore file, so I'm just going to create it on the command line from the get-go to make sure it's there. Oh wait, it's got the dot. That's why we can't see it. Okay, let's just open this. So I'll use the code command with VS Code. If you haven't set this up yet, it's a nice little thing to have. You can always just open VS Code. It opened on my other screen, so there it is. Boop. Now come back. All right, so it's pretty empty right now. All we have is this little git ignore file here. So not that exciting of a repository just yet. But let's talk a little bit about this git ignore. So can anyone explain to me what this get ignore file is all about and what kind of things we might want to put inside of it? And yes, gettable is not a technical term, but it's actually a term that I made up just 2 minutes ago. But I would encourage you guys to use it. Maybe it will spread. Files you don't want to commit. Yeah, so absolutely. And usually the files you don't want to commit, there's going to be a reason for that. And you guys have already thrown out the biggie, the node modules. Why don't we want to commit the node modules? There are a few different ways to think about or answer that question. I see you guys are typing. Because they take up huge space. That is, practically speaking, yeah, we don't want to, every time we're pushing something up to GitHub, to have to push and pull down our node modules. And in fact, we don't have to. So we don't want to and we don't have to. That's the whole idea behind having a package.json, is that we don't have to pass these around. And we'll be exploring that and talking more about that a lot more in just a little bit. So there's another guy that is nice to throw into this get ignore from the get-go, assuming you're on a Mac like me, and that is our DS store. Oops, not BS store. So if you guys don't know what DS store is, it's a little thing that Macs automatically create to track certain preferences, and they are annoying from the perspective of a developer. So, and yeah, they're not necessary if you're on a Windows. I don't think there's any sort of Windows equivalent, but I could be wrong about that. I haven't really used Windows since I started programming. There is not. Awesome. Okay, so there we go. We have our get ignore file. So, and one thing, just a side note, if you're curious, if you poke around on GitHub and look for get ignores on GitHub, you can find a bunch of really great prefabbed recommended get ignore files that are put together for different languages. So that can be a nice place to reference if you want a really complete list of things that you probably want to ignore. But I'll let you guys explore that on your own if you are interested. So let's move on to node modules. And I will open my terminal. Let's put this over here. No, I always split it instead of I've been meaning, I have my to-do list. I've had put down, like, sit down and just play with VS Code for like an hour. So I quit just like wasting time in class messing with it, but I haven't gotten into it yet. Okay, so we want to, that's what I want. And then I want to get rid of one of these. Let's do that. Just wasting your time trying to figure out how to work this thing. Anyone know how I close out my extra little terminal here? Oh, there we go. Trash can. Nice. Yeah, if you guys want to send me resources and recommendations of things I need to know about VS Code, that would be more than welcome. Okay, a question about how did I open getignore in VS Code? So getignore is just a file. So I just clicked on it and it opened. As far as how I actually created it, I did that in my terminal. The touch command just means create a, you know, it's like, think of like God and Adam. You touch it and life appears. That's how I remember the touch command. And the reason it doesn't show in the terminal is because anything with a dot before it is going to be automatically ignored by the ls command, and I'm completely spacing the flag. It might just be an A. Yeah, so if you do ls-a, it'll show you anything that's hidden in here. So that means it has a dot before it. Cool. All right, so let's talk a little bit about node modules. So we already mentioned a little bit about what they are and why they're nice. So it's, for starters, a node module is going to be some chunk of code that someone else has written that we want to use in our code, which is like one of the beautiful, beautiful things about the open source internet is a bunch of the work that we might have had to do has already been done for us. We just have to find it and install it. So how it works, right, is someone creates a package or a library and they put it on GitHub or they put it on NPM, and then we want to install a copy of it, right? We want to actually physically take all of their code and install it onto our computer. So it's physically on our hard drive and available for us. And that is something that's going to appear in node modules. So let's start by doing this with probably the most basic package that we're going to want, which is Express. Not basic in that it's simple, basic in that if we're building a server, we probably want Express. So let's go ahead and do that. The first thing we need to do, though, is we need to do a yarn and init. And I'll be doing these commands in yarn. You can do all of this in NPM as well. Cool. So that just created a package.json for me. So now that that's been initialized, I can add things to it. So let's go ahead and do yarn add express. Cool. All right. So in some ways, I just did something very simple, but I actually just did something very complex. And what does the Y do? All right, let me go back and explain that. So when you do yarn and init, it will ask a bunch of questions. The Y says, let's just answer yes to all of them. So if you want to be lazy and not customize anything, just do the -Y and it'll save you some time. I think it just sets up, you know, it would ask me name, version. I think it just goes through this list and asks me these things. And I haven't had that email address in like 3 years. So don't try to contact me there. I will never get it. All right. So let's go. Okay. So let's talk about, package.json. What does what's the point of package.json? JSON. This thing is a pretty critical piece of our repository, but what is it doing? What was the last code I ran? The last code was adding Express. So yarn add Express. Yeah, so the package.json does a few things. One of them is it holds our dependencies, and that's a good place to start. So everything we add with this yarn add is going to be a dependency. So right now we have one dependency. We can see it right there, Express. So Express exists. There are two different expresses in here. There's this Express that's listed in package.json, and that's more like the idea of Express. This is kind of like the table of contents. This is telling us everything we're going to be using. Or maybe the ingredients list in a recipe would be a better way to go, a reference, exactly. But there's also a literal Express in here somewhere hiding. Is it in, where does it appear? I don't know. I'm not used to digging through the node modules. I just like to ignore it and be like, yay, thank you for working. Well, somewhere in that node modules exists the actual code for Express. So we have the literal code for Express. We know that because we're able to use it even if our computer's offline. But we also, more importantly, have this reference to it. So when we're pushing this code to share with, say, our fellow developers, we don't have to push the actual full giant files that contain Express. We just have to push this one reference. And that means that we can all get on the same page, even though we're not having to physically pass around a bunch of files. Is there one named, did I just miss one named Express? I didn't see one actually called Express in here. Oh, there it is. I'm just blind. It's right there, alphabetically where it should be. Nice. Okay. And so I see a question. When we do yarn init, we don't have to do npm init. That is correct. So npm and yarn are two things that do very similar tasks. They're both package managers. So you can use whichever one you prefer. It's nice to practice with both. But yeah, if you're doing yarn commands, you don't have to do NPM commands or their equivalents. And if you're doing NPMs, you don't have to bother with yarn. Mm-hmm. And apparently if you mix and match, it can break things. So let's pick one and stick to it per repository. All right, I see another question. Cool. Actually, this is a really cool question. So let's say instead of, I'm actually going to go in and delete Express if I can find it again. All right, you're going to be deleted. All right, so Express has just been removed. So let's say that we got rid of that. And I'm going to do a yarn. So, and yarn is the same as yarn install. So nothing was installed, right? Express was not added. If I wanted to actually type out Express in the version or type out a different dependency, I could do that and it would work exactly the same. And then if I did yarn, it would, save. And then I do yarn, and now it's actually installing it. So this add command is just a shorthand. If you ever wanted to manually type it out, you could do that too. The add is just a shorthand for adding this into our package.json. So pretty much you don't really gain anything by typing it out, but I think that asking about that and talking about that is awesome because it allows you to think about what does this add command really do. It just adds it to the package.json, and it will also actually download it. But if you delete it from your node modules, you can always get it back by installing. And as a reminder, yarn is a shorthand for yarn install. So if I just type yarn by itself, I'm saying I want to install. Does that allow us to add a specific version? Yeah, so I believe there's a V flag or something like that where I always forget these things, but you're welcome to look that up. I think there's a V flag so that if you want to still use the yarn commands and specify the version, you can do that. But if we decided, you know what, Express 3, that's where it was at. Actually, the caret would still potentially upgrade it. But if I took off the caret and said, I want 3.16.4, which might not even exist, I don't know. I could do that, but let's stick with. Cool. And so yes, we can edit package.json directly. So back to this question of what does package.json do? One of the answers is, we can see that it keeps track of metadata about that's really the most broad answer, is it keeps track of metadata about our repository. In this case, we can see it keeps track of the name of it and the author and the license, and it also keeps track of the dependencies. That's one of the most important jobs that package.json has. Yes, and we could create a nonsensical Pi themed version of Express. I do appreciate the Pi reference. Anyways. Yeah, great question. So Christopher asked, when we fork a repo and run yarn install, it reads from the package.json and installs those packages listed under dependencies. That is exactly right. That is spot on. So that is what is happening when you run that command. All right, I see a bunch of people typing, so I'm gonna wait and see if there are more questions before moving on. I see a question about the difference between dependencies and dev dependencies. I'm going to skip over that question for right now because we are going to talk about it in a minute. But what I do want to talk about next is, speaking of differences, is the difference between package.json and the lock file. I'm not sure. Sorry, I know I just said something and then I got all distracted. So the question is there a way to import, add dependencies, then export this file? Could you possibly find a different way to ask that question? I'm not sure I quite understand. Instead of typing it out. So I apologize if I'm not quite answering your question. Really, the only two ways I know of adding dependencies are you can either literally type it out in here, which is not preferred, or you could use the yarn add or npm add commands to add them in, and that will automatically add them in package.json. You could also, I shouldn't say this, you could also download the dependency and copy and paste it into your node module, which would work until you sent it up to GitHub and someone else pulled it down, and then they wouldn't be able to get that back. So definitely don't use that option. It would work in the short term, but totally mess someone up in the long term. All right, so let's talk about this lock file. This lock file is kind of cool. It's kind of new. Back when I was learning this stuff, Yarn wasn't even a thing. And Yarn kind of appeared as this competitor to NPM and introduced a couple things that NPM didn't have, including this lock file. But then NPM responded and added it in. So, and I don't want to dig too much into what the lock file does. But essentially, it has to do with versioning. So there's some wiggle room built into the versions here. This caret that I briefly mentioned, it basically means any version of Express within release 4. So release 4 is going to be like a major version, but there can be bug fixes and minor updates that don't break it within there. So I'm saying anything equivalent to this or higher as long as we don't go past 4. That's what this little caret means, which is good and bad. The bad side of it is that if I npm install, if you and I are on a dev team and we both have the same repo, and I yarn install or npm install, and then they release a new version of Express, and then you install a couple days later, our code might not actually be exactly the same. And that's not ideal. So this lock file essentially locks a version in so that it's a way to guarantee that all of us will be on the same page, that everyone using the same repository is literally using the same version. So once again, I don't want to spend too much time on this lock file. I don't think it's as important to understand as package.json, but if you're curious about it, feel free to do some YouTube video searches and learn a little more about the lock file and how that works. All right, what do we want to talk about next? Okay, let's talk about scripts. So here is, as I said, the package.json is kind of a warehouse for metadata about our repository. And another thing that we can store in here is scripts. So scripts are just shorthands for if there's a file or a chunk of code we know we're going to want to run a lot, we can create a script in here, and that's going to be a shorthand way of doing it. So, and actually, before we get any further with this, let me go ahead and create an index.js. This is kind of, by default, the index.js is going to be the starting point of our repository. So, and we'll just put a simple little console log in here. So we know we're going to want to be running index.js pretty frequently. And does anyone remember from night 1, what if we just want to run a JavaScript file using Node? If we just want to run a single file, what is the command? Nodemon is probably the command we want to use, but what's the even more basic, barest bones command for running a file in Node? Node, exactly. That question was so easy, it was actually hard. So we could just run node, oh, it's not server, it's index.js. And that tells us just run this file. So node followed by the file name. And we know we're going to want to be running that a bunch, so let's actually put this into a script. So I'm going to go over to package.json, create, and notice that the main file has already been specified in here. We'll do scripts. And start is a pretty standard script, so we'll do, there we go. Cool, so now we should be able to just run yarn start, and it actually runs this file. So node index.js and yarn start aren't, it's not really that much more code, but let's say we were dealing with a more database-oriented repository and we had to run all these like nasty SQL schema files that have a million flags to run them, it becomes very convenient to put something in a script. Another reason to do it is we like to always know that the command is going to be yarn start. So it's nice to always be on the same page, that yarn start is the command that will start our server. So it's standard that yarn start is this command, but yarn start doesn't do anything without this chunk of code. So if I just ran yarn start, nothing would happen. We get an error. So don't take yarn start for granted. It only works because there's a script specified in our package.json. This question of is a single versus double quotes important? Yes, it is. And that's because we're using JSON instead of JavaScript. So as a reminder, JSON is this weird language that's pretty much just like JavaScript objects, but there are a couple things it's strict about. Like our keys have to be in quotes and all our quotes have to be double. So yes, it is important to do double quotes in a JSON file, but if you're just doing regular JavaScript, single quotes will work just fine. Does scripts usually go in a particular place? I usually see them beneath main, which is why I put them there, but you could put it anywhere and it would still work. Can there be more than one script? Yep, as many as we want. Can we yarn add a script? I don't know if there is a yarn shortcut to adding scripts. Let's do a little Google search on that. Create scripts. I'm not seeing anything from the get-go, and I don't want to spend too much time on this. If anyone knows of a way to do that, please share, but I am not aware of one. All right, so right now, start just runs index.js with the node command. Why don't we like the node command? What is the limitation of the node command that becomes kind of annoying when we're creating servers? Give you a little hint, which is if I change this, it doesn't refresh. If I change the code in here, I will have to run it a second time. So there is a lovely little package that is designed to solve this very problem. And it's called Nodemon, which you guys already brought up. So even though node is in some ways the go-to command for running a JavaScript script in the node environment, we don't like to use it, at least for development purposes, because it's annoying, because it's a giant waste of time to have to save and run things every time we change stuff, because we're constantly changing stuff. So if I wanted to use Nodemon instead, what would be my first step? yeah, I would have to add it. And if I wanted to do it the hard way, I could just type it into here. But otherwise, I'll just add it. And I want one extra little thing, -d, which we'll talk about in just a second. -d means it is a dev dependency instead of a regular dependency. You could also do --dev. So let's keep a close eye on package.json. There it is. So not only did it add itself into package.json, it actually added itself in a totally new category, dev dependencies. So the difference between dependencies and dev dependencies are, you really would just ask this question of, do I need this tool for my code being live, being deployed, or is it just something used for development purposes? So when our code is actually deployed, it's not like we're going to be changing things and restarting the server. It's static at that point. It's just up and running. So there's no sense in using nodemon when something's deployed, because it's just running. No one's changing the files dynamically as it's deployed, hopefully. So this means that as long as we're in development, we'll have this available. But when we actually push this, when it actually goes live, we'll no longer waste space deploying this dependency that we know we won't use. So it's just a little way to, one, help you think about what am I actually using this package for, and two, it's a way to save some space by not having your live product to have to pull in dependencies it doesn't really need. So that's a dev dependency. Okay, so we want to use nodemon. We have it actually installed. Let's double check it's in our node modules, as long as I can find things alphabetically. Don't tell me it's not here. Oh, actually, I know where it is. Is it? No. I can't find anything in the node modules tonight. Will I remove the dev dependencies before I push to development, or does it automatically get removed? I actually don't know the answer to that, because I've never, the deployment, we'll learn about deployments actually, I think on Wednesday. But to be totally honest, deployment usually happens by actual like DevOps people. So until on Wednesday, I haven't deployed anything in quite a long time. So I actually don't know the answer to that. If anyone, I would assume that it automatically happens since it has a different category, but I don't know that 100% sure. I guess we'll find out. And as far as my last command, where are you? I did yarn add nodemon -D. So we now have it added in. How do we get it so that our start script is actually using nodemon instead of just node? We just change the script. So nodemon is just kind of a stand-in for node. So now let's try running yarns. Oops. And we see our log appears. It restarts. Oh wait, I have to save it. It'll restart. And every time I change this file and save it, it restarts and runs it again. So that's really nice for development purposes. Didn't I check in bin? Oh well, it's somewhere. It's clearly somewhere because it's working. All right, so cool. I'm gonna give you guys just a few minutes to catch up with all of this. So if you have any questions about commands or anything we've gone over, let me know. I'll just give you a few minutes to catch up with this. Yeah, I'm not seeing it. It's just one of life's great mysteries. I wonder if installing will, it says that everything's up to date. Yeah, I don't know. That's weird. All right, question. How do you get NodeMon to be watching? So all you have to do is run yarn start as long as your package.json is set up so that start runs the NodeMon command. You run yarn start, and then it will be watching. And if you want to kill it, you can do, it's, I think, Control C. Yeah, Control C will kill it. And then yarn start will start it again. All right, I see a couple questions popping up. So one question is, something doesn't seem to be working with someone's NodeMon. There are a couple things that could be going wrong. Of course, first one is making sure it's actually installed. Second one is making sure your start script actually uses it. So make sure that you have a start script and that it's pointing at a command using NodeMon. And then the last piece is make sure your index.js exists and there's something in it. And another little fun fact is that I'm pretty sure we don't need index.js. It will automatically run this with whatever main is set to. So we can make this even shorter and just do the NodeMon command, and it'll take a look at whatever file is in main and run that automatically. Next question is about why do we only use NodeMon with a server? And it looks like that already got answered in Slack, but for anyone watching later who's curious, it's because there's already a similar process built into React. So this kind of watching and restarting thing, React will take care of that for you. All right, hopefully people are mostly caught up. That is pretty much all we have in terms of getting the bones set up for our repo. So this is stuff that it's easy to take for granted, but I'm really glad that we took some time to break it all down and explain all of it. You guys had a lot of good questions and observations. So I'm hoping that you feel more confident about what these things that you're used to using are and how they really work. The next step is, right now, our index.js is just a single console log, not exactly a server just yet. So I want you guys to actually get Express up and running here. So in here, we should be creating an Express server. We want an endpoint for get at just the root. Which way does the slash go? Always a good question. Trying to remember. I always forget the stupidest things. And then we want it to listen. So I'm gonna actually let you guys work with your code for 5 minutes and get all of this up and running using the stuff that we learned last week. So I'll set a 5-minute timer. If anyone's still behind on the other stuff, you can go ahead and keep catching up. We'll go over how to do this in just a minute, but I want you guys to work it through on your own, and I'll keep answering any questions in the meantime. So we have 5 minutes to create a simple server with a single endpoint. Is copy and paste valid? No, type it out. Trust me, you'll save yourself so much time in the long run if you just type it out a couple times and commit it to memory so you don't have to hunt down a code base to copy it from whenever you need one. But yeah, try and type it out, and here's another challenge. Instead of referencing your code base or your homework or the code I posted earlier, reference the Express docs if you get stuck. All right, fine. You get an extra minute since you can't copy and paste. I think that this party Furby is my go-to little reaction creepy thing in Slack for tonight. For those of you just watching the video who can't see Slack, it's okay. It's terrifying. You shouldn't have to see it. All right, I'm gonna do a quick poll, see if you guys are ready to move on. All right, I see someone is having trouble getting their package.json. So in order to get your package.json, you would probably want to run the command that you might need is yarn init, and you can use that -y to skip forward. So I'll post that in Slack right now. So you ran yarn init y, and the package.json didn't appear. I would, as far as what goes in the endpoint, we don't have any sort of database methods, but I would still send something. I would send any sort of response back. So I do want in this endpoint for you to send a response back, but it's up to you what that response is. As far as the package.json not appearing with yarn init, I'm not sure where that would be. And I'm not sure that I can take the time to troubleshoot that specific problem. So if you're still having trouble with it afterwards, you can reach out to me, or maybe one of the PMs can help you out with that. Are other yarn commands working? All right, so let's go ahead and go through how to do this. So creating an Express server is step one. First, we need to require Express. And remember, we installed this at the very beginning. We know that we have it because there it is. If we hadn't already added it, we would have needed to do that. And Express is a function. No. It's just a function, and it returns this server object. So I'll go ahead and call it. And I'm going to go ahead and just define a port up here. So there we go. We've created this server thing, so now we can create our endpoint. So server.get. And get, as well as our other request methods, there's going to be a, did I ever figure out which way the slash goes? I think it's that way. Is that one the backslash or the, I feel like such a ditz sometime, but I really should learn what the difference between a backslash and a front slash. But every time I think I have it, I realize it's actually reversed. Okay, we'll fall forward. Okay, so it's like if you fall forward, it's a forward slash. Nice. All right, that's good. That'll help me remember. So then we do rec and res. So this callback with the homies is going to be our second parameter. And as I mentioned, I just want you guys to send a response. Or JSON response. I'll do JSON just for good measure, but either one would work. All right, and then the last step, of course, is to listen. So server.listen, we have to pass in a port and then another callback. All right, let's save it. We've got our little listening message. So that's always a good sign. And let me go ahead and try out localhost 5050 and see what we get here. Cool, looks good. So this is just taking some of that stuff we worked on last week and implementing out a bare bones server. All right. Well, it is almost 8 o'clock or whatever o'clock, wherever you are. Let's go ahead and take our break, and then we will come back to this, and we will finally get to the middleware part of the middleware lesson. So I will see you guys in another 5 minutes. Still don't know how to set this thing. Here we go. All right, I see a question. I'm not able to see my scripts. When you say you're not able to see them, do you mean in packet, like you literally don't see a list of scripts in package.json, or do you mean something else? So remember, let me turn that off. I actually added this in here. So I actually typed this on in here. So I would go ahead and add it yourself. All right, any other questions before we move on? All right. Oh, I see someone typing. Is there a difference between nodemon index.js versus just, yeah, good question. So is there a difference between this command and this command? And the answer is, in this case, no. Because when you leave this off, it will default to whatever's in main. But let's say that we also had a server.js that we wanted to run. In that case, we would need to either put that in there directly or change main. So the short answer is there are two ways to run files. One is to actually type it out in the script, at least when you're running with nodemon. And the second way is to make sure the file matches what main is. So, and if you're ever trying to have a script that ran a non-main file, you would definitely want to type out the actual name of that file. All right, let's move on to middleware. All right, so we're going to put some middleware right here. But before we do that, what is this middleware business? What is it? Why is it important? What does it do? What have we used so far that's middleware? All good questions. And I just threw a bunch of questions all at you at once. Tell me everything you know about middleware up until this point. What are the different types of middleware? It's like a Chrome extension. I like that. Yeah, it's an extension onto our Express app. Remember, Express is extremely bare bones. The stuff that you get just from running this Express function is minimal. They're trying to not give you any extra junk you might not need. When you inevitably need extra junk, you have to put it in yourself. But it's pretty easy to put it in, so. Yeah, so as far as what is it, it's extras. Why does it exist? Essentially, so your app isn't toting around any extra code it doesn't need. Here's another question I asked. What middleware have we used so far? Is there any middleware we've used in previous lessons or on our homework? So body parser, cores, all good answers. So we didn't, cores we haven't really talked about yet. We will talk about it. I think I'll mention it extremely briefly tonight. Let's see, we've used some built-in Express middleware that no one has mentioned yet. .use is the method that lets us use middleware, but JSON, yeah, that was the one I was really looking for. Remember when we did this server.use express.json that allowed us to parse the body? That is middleware. And then, and someone mentioned body parser. There's another library called body parser that does something very similar to this, that this thing actually uses under the hood. So that's another example of middleware, though at this point it's easier to just use express.json. Cool, and the other thing that technically, I don't like to think about this too much because it gets a little confusing. Technically, these route handlers are actually middleware too. So pretty much everything in Express is actually middleware. But when we say middleware, we're usually not talking about route handlers. We're usually talking about stuff that comes before route handlers. So there are really three types of middleware, kind of three categories. There's built-in, which is something like express.json. It's actually already built in on the library. We do have to call it in order to use it, but it's built in for us. Built, not built. So there's built-in. Next is we can use third-party libraries, so things like body parser, or we'll look at a couple of those in just a minute. And then the last one, which we'll talk about at the end, is custom. So essentially, if it's something that's really, really, really commonly used, it's probably already built in on Express, like this parsing JSON onto the body. Used all the time, so they built it in. If it's still pretty common but wasn't worthy of being attached on Express, there is undoubtedly a library for it, and you can add it with Yarn, you can require it, and then you can plug it in using server.use. We'll see that in a minute. The last one is custom. If you have some weird thing that you want your app to do that probably is specific to your app, chances are there is not a library for it. But never fear, you can plug a function into this server.use and customize it. And we'll play with that at the end of class as well. So let's talk about a couple of commonly used third-party middlewares, two libraries called Helmet and Morgan. So I have the documentation pulled up over here. Let's just pop on over and take a look at these. So I'm gonna start off with, actually let's start off with Helmet. We're gonna mess around with Morgan a little more. Helmet it's called Helmet because it's like armor. It's just a really simple way to add a little more security to your app. So there's a little in the docs, it tells you how to install it, it shows you how to require it, and then use it. So really this is all we need to do. The rest is taken care of for us. There are options if you want to specify exactly how it works, but all we need is this code here and we'll be good to go. Well, our app will all of a sudden be more secure. So let's do it. So step one, I'm going to, oh no, I meant to split it this time. So I want to keep my server running, so I opened another terminal so that I can add new dependencies. Are all NPM packages available using Yarn add? To my knowledge, yes. I'm pretty sure, but you might want to fact check me on that one. Yeah, a lot of the documentation, since Yarn is newer, a lot of the documentation just says NPM install because for so long that was just the gold standard. All right, so let's do Yarn add Helmet. I'm not going to look for it in the node modules this time because either it will be mysteriously hidden or I just won't be able to see it. All right, cool. So we did that. Helmet. And then down here we can do, I believe it's just server use helmet, right? Helmet's a function. So it's a function that returns the middleware. Good to know. So down here, we'll do server.use. That's the syntax for plugging in middleware, Helmet. So ta-da! You can't really see it, but we have more security now. Let's plug Morgan in. Morgan's a little more fun because we can actually see something. So Morgan is a logger. Why is a logger called Morgan? Because the developers who created it were big Dexter fans. And presumably because there was already a bunch of different logger named modules, so they came up with a more clever name. All right, so we see that this one, more specifications of how we can define it. But yeah, so as I said, it is a logger. So it's just going to give us info about our request. So let's go ahead and install this one as well. Should make that go away. Okay, so Yarn, nope, wrong terminal. Yarn add Morgan. Oops, that says part. So these two that we're messing with right now are third-party libraries. So a custom one, you wouldn't have to add anything. You wouldn't have to require anything. You could, well, require a different file in your file structure. But a custom one, we will build from scratch. So right now we're dealing with third-party libraries. So they're not built into Express, but they're already written for us. So all we have to do is, I'll call it logger. Require Morgan. And then server.use. And I'm going to go ahead and put in the tiny option. So that's just how it logs. Uh-oh. Oh, logger, not Morgan. Cool. So let's actually make a request. I'll go back to my localhost 5050 and check that out. Now all of a sudden we saw a GET request over here. And so the reason you might be wondering, wait, why is it a 304 instead of a 200? It's because I think this 304 thing came up with you guys at one point, and I don't know if I clearly explained it. So when I make a request here, oh, first I have to let my server restart. Oh, I guess it's cached. Curse you, Chrome, for knowing what I'm up to. So the 304 comes back because it's like, hey, I already made a request here and I got the same thing back. So let's change what we're getting back. This should fix it. Cool. So I requested this and I got back this message and Chrome sent me, and so Chrome received this 200. And now all of a sudden we see that there's a little log message about it. If I make the request again, I'll get a 304, which is Chrome's way of saying, hey, I already pinged this endpoint and nothing has changed. So just, it's cool because now that we have that logger in here, all of a sudden we have a little better idea of the subtle things that are going on behind the scenes. I see someone getting a reference error, helmet is not defined. Did you require helmet and save it in a constant called helmet at the top? My guess is one or all of this step was forgotten. So yeah, our logger. And if we, and these parameters, there's another one that's I think called dev. So if we change this, let's send another request. I really didn't change much. It kind of looks almost exactly the same. Let's see what other options we can plug into Morgan. Cool, so we can use if we want to specifically say how to format this thing, we could put in this beautiful little format string. Nice. We can customize, so we can essentially customize our format string. So even though it's not a custom bit of middleware, we can do some formatting customization if we want. Or we could just use something like Tiny and it's set up for us nicely. So that is Morgan for you. A nice thing, honestly, just a nice thing to add from the get-go. I would recommend, even if it's not required, just be adding this to all of your servers. It'll help you it'll give you one more visual cue of what's actually going on with your code. Why are we using logger, not just Morgan? So the short answer is because I decided to name it that. We could have called it Morgan if we wanted. I just think logger is a little more descriptive. What is the helmet doing? To talk about what helmet is really doing would be a big conversation that I don't want to have right now because I want to talk about some other things. The short answer is it just adds extra security to your app. As far as what's really going on behind the scenes, I will let you guys investigate that yourselves if you're curious. And yes, as Javier brought up, you can just use one server.use and pass these all in. I personally like to put them on different lines. I just find it a little more readable. So I'm a big believer in more lines of code is fine, make it more readable. But actually, since helmet is kind of invisible, let's put that on one line. comment that out. Let's make sure it's still working. And we see it's still logging. So yes, there's syntactically, you can put a list in, or you can do separate server use. Probably, honestly, maybe the sleekest way would just to be, if you wanted it on one line, you could always do something like that as well, if that's, so, you know, different projects and different teams will have different style guides, but just play with different syntaxes and find something that you find to be the most readable. That one looks kind of weird to me still. Morgan Dev versus Morgan Tiny. I'm not actually sure. I usually use Tiny, but I noticed the Dev was being used. I was looking at old videos of this class and I thought I'd try it out. But the only thing I saw was different is that these two dashes had moved. So I don't know the difference, honestly. They looked almost equivalent to me. Where would we put that function for Morgan? So if we wanted to customize it, you'd actually pass a function directly in here. Let's look at that syntax one more time on the docs. So yeah, notice that you pass this tokens recres function into Morgan. And there's, I haven't messed too much with customizing these, so I'm not a customized Morgan expert by any means, but the point is not to know all these libraries per se, but to know how to find a new library and use the docs to figure out how it works. So usually a good place to start is you take what's on the docs, you copy and paste it, and then you start tinkering and seeing what changes what and what breaks what. Oh, the color is different. Okay, let's try that. So we have dev. Let's do a, let's try this. Ooh, so 404 is orange. If we change this to tiny, is it going to? Ah, there's a color thing. Now we know. Nice one. Does it matter where you add the middleware? Excellent question. Yes, it does. So Express is going to be read top down. So notice that Morgan is being used before the route handler. So we know that it's read top down. What's going to happen if I move this here? Any guesses on what's going to happen when I run this GET request through the browser? So what do you think is going to happen with this middleware? Nothing. Yep. What if I had another request handler here? What would happen now? Yeah, it'll work on the second request. So nothing there, but if I do, now we see that it's being logged. So let's go ahead and move it back where we want it. So anything, I will slightly amend what I said earlier. This is where middleware that you want to be used throughout the app goes. And order matters on middleware. Sometimes these middlewares all work independently of each other, but sometimes you have one middleware that then feeds into a different one. You have to make sure that the first one that you want to run first is above the other one on the code. Yep, so and actually I just said that, but I noticed someone had asked that. So yes, in the case of these three libraries, it does not matter. Order does not matter. But if you had middleware that was interacting, for example, if you had some sort of authorizing middleware, you would probably want that one to go first, because if they're not authorized, it really shouldn't move on to anything else in the chain. All right, I'm going to give you guys just a few minutes to catch up on all of this. I'll keep answering questions in Slack, and let's just get you guys caught up. And yes, backend is beautiful. It can also be very, very ugly if done wrong. All right, I see someone's Morgan is not working. Can you give me any more info? Are you actually making GET requests with the browser? Is it saved? Are you calling it like a function? Have you required it correctly? Feel free to, if you want to post your code into Slack, that might be an easier way to take a look at why it might not be working. Cool. So yeah, if anyone else is having the same problem, you won't see anything logged except the requests. So make sure that you're actually making a request using either the browser like I've been using or using Postman if you want. All right, we have another question. I noticed it's not updating when I change the text, but if I click on the address bar and hit enter, I get the request. When you say change the text, do you mean the text in your text editor? If so, when you change, if you change the text in here, like for example, if I change the message and press save, what I've done here is I've changed the server. So I've now changed, okay, if you make a request to me, you're going to get back something different. But that won't go into effect, or no result will be seen until this request gets made. So this is still a vestige from my request from back before the code changed. So even though the server is different at the point I press saved, you won't see the result of it until you make another GET request. As far as the difference between plugging these all into one server use, to my knowledge, one, like the first one might be slightly more optimized, but maybe not even that. But for your purposes, no, just two different ways of doing the same thing. There's always little subtle differences behind the scenes, but I think we can ignore those. All right, I'm going to do a little poll, see if everyone is ready to move on. One second. All right, just submitted that. All right, I'm seeing lots of agrees and strongly agrees. So let's go ahead and write some custom middleware. All right, it's back over here. All right, so if I wanted to write custom middleware, I really, instead of plopping something else like one of these libraries in here, I actually would put my own custom function into server use. Oops. So we have 3 parameters in this. I bet you guys can guess what 2 out of 3 of the parameters inside of this, this custom middleware function are. Rec and res, yes, we always love the homies. So rec, res, and then the other one is next, and we will talk about the importance of next in a minute. So these rec and res buddies are just being passed down the line here. So if we ever, and you'll see something like this on your homework, if you ever wanted to change the body, like reformat the body, if you know that, hey, the format I'm expecting to receive and the format that would be useful to me is always going to, like, it's coming in an object, but I'd rather it be an array, or it's coming in nested arrays, but I'd rather flatten it. You could always actually manipulate what's on the rec and then pass it down the line. But we'll do something slightly more simple here. That was just kind of a weird example I thought of. Not that weird. Relevant to what you're doing on the homework tonight. So what instead we're going to do is a little bit of pseudo authentication. So let's say that we are expecting a password from our user, and it's going to come in the form of a query string. So we want our user who's sending this GET request to send us a password in the form of a query string. So it's going to be one of the keys on our query string. How are we going to get to that password? Or maybe more specifically, how do we access keys on our query string? Talked about this at the very end of the lecture on Thursday. To start, we know it's on rec, right? If we're looking for something from the client, it's always going to be on rec. And params, if it were coming from the actual route, but we want a query string. So rec.query is right, and then the key is going to be pass. And as a little reminder, the difference between a query string and a parameter is actually built into the route. So if we had something like /users/1 for a user ID, that's a parameter. But instead, if we had something like ID equals 4, that's going to be a query string. So I want you guys to have a little more practice with query strings. So we'll do that. Okay. So we now have grabbed the password. So they may or may not have given us a password, and it may or may not be correct. And in this case, the correct password is going to be ferret, because I got some feedback this weekend about more ferrets in lectures. So let's check if the password is correct. So if pass equals ferret, we want to do one thing. Otherwise, we might want to do something else. What do you guys think? What if we're looking for a correct password in order to access our server? What do you think we want to do if the password's correct? And what do you think we want to do if the password is incorrect? Just using kind of common sense. Give the access or refuse the, excuse me, or refuse the access. So let's start with refusing the access. So we will probably want to send a response over here, something like res.status. Let's do JSON. Cool, so let's try that out. So if I try and let's make our endpoint a little more interesting here. So if I try to do entrance, let's say I just even leave off the query string. I get invalid password. If I add a query string, Close, but not quite right. So we see that this part isn't working, and we can see from our logger that we're getting a 400 back. So that's good. So that works. What about if the password is correct? What do you think we want to do? Send a different response. Not exactly. Because if they have access, we really want them to be able to get to the actual route handler. And right now the route handler is a little lame because there's no database in here, but presumably this route handler would actually query the database and send back something interesting. Call next. Brilliant. I bet you guys had thought, most of you guys had forgotten about our little next friend. Yeah, so if we want to allow them through, next is exactly what we do. So let's just, actually, I'm going to comment it out. Let's see what happens when we put in the correct password. It just spins and spins and spins and spins and spins forevermore. That's what happens when the server is waiting for a response and that response never comes. This is how servers develop abandonment issues. We don't like that. It costs a lot of money to send our browsers to therapy. So we want to make sure they get a response. So we need to either send a response or call next so that it will go on to another piece of code that does send the response. So let's try it now and see it finally timed out. Sweet. We can change this to something. Is that? Yeah, I think it's that way. Let's try it now. Cool. So that's how you do it. You can write extremely simple custom middleware. You can write extremely complicated custom middleware. But the point is that Express is set up so that you have access to this rec res and next, and you can do all sorts of cool custom things with it. You can access all of that stuff on the request. You can even send responses. You can set headers. Or you could just say next and say, okay, we're going to allow you to move on. So that's just a little hint of the stuff we can do with custom middleware. The last thing I want to show you guys is some just a little bit of good coding practice. So this thing is starting to get a little clunky. We have this nasty bit of middleware here. So if we wanted to move this thing out so that it's not making our middleware, and imagine this being inside of, if we just plopped this anonymous function in here, right? Oh, and actually, before I talk about this, one little thing about order. So notice that this gatekeeper thing is coming after Morgan. So if I send the wrong password, we see it still gets logged, that's good. That's what we want. We want to see it. But notice that if I moved Morgan after this bit of middleware, we would never even see it. So we definitely want to make sure that Morgan is before anything that might stop the progress. Otherwise, we might miss something. So a little example of why order matters. Now let's go back to that issue I just mentioned, which is that this anonymous function inside of the server use looks gross. It's just like visually, and this is a pretty simple middleware. Imagine if this thing were, you could have middleware that took up 500 lines. Not good. So let's talk a little bit about how we might modularize this out. So one nice thing would be to create a directory or a file where custom middleware could live. So we could, this thing has kind of just been named middleware. So let's go ahead and create a file. We'll do this in the simplest way possible. And we'll just call this custom middleware.js. Cool. So now we can actually pull this thing out of here. Plop it over here. And let's call this gatekeeper. Cool. And little reminder, why did I put gatekeeper on module exports? What's up with this weird thing that I did up here? You guys remember how module exports works in Node? It's kind of a new Node thing. We talked about it, right? I think we did. I'm pretty sure we did. If we haven't talked about this at all, let me know and I will explain it from the beginning. We have not. Oh, awesome. I get to talk about module exports. So this is our way of being able to require other files that we write. So let me actually make the syntax a little easier. So let's start here. Okay, I've stored this thing in a function called gatekeeper. Cool. And let's get rid of that parenthesis. It's not doing us any favors. So what I know we have seen is how to require files. So we can require these modules, right? But we can also require files in our own code base. So if I wanted custom middleware, I could require, not customer, middleware.js. The JS is optional, but so I could do this too. All right, so I've actually required this thing. So what is this? What is this custom MW thing equal to? We know that these things are all equal to functions that are outputted by these external libraries. What is this custom middleware constant equal to? Or if we don't know, how could we find out? Is it equal to the entire file? Is it equal to the function? All good guesses. But there's an easy way for us to find out for sure. All right, let's save it. An empty object. Oh dear. Why is it an empty object? Well, honestly, your guesses were more intuitive than what it really is, which is it turns out that by default, every file is an empty object. And in fact, it's equal to, there's an object called module.exports that exists in every file. And by default, this thing is empty. So whenever you require a file, you get its module.exports. But to start, it's going to be empty. So if we want to put something on it, we have to actually put something on it. So I'm now going to put a gatekeeper thing on here and set it equal to this gatekeeper function. So this module exports, it's like the outbound thing. It's the part, it's almost like a mini API within our API. It's the part of this file we want to expose. And by default, it's blank. So now I've created a new key on it called gatekeeper and set it equal to this function. So now if we go into index.js, we see that or our custom middleware object is no longer empty. There's a gatekeeper function on it. So here's the final question. Yes, and this is exactly like what we did with DB. Let me actually even open our old, so we can see, no, yes, I do want to save this. Let's open this real quick. So you can see that you kind of already used this without even realizing what you were using. So we've been working with this DB file. Notice that all of these functions that you were able to use from DB are stored in the module.exports. So you've already used this. You just didn't even know it yet. Really good observation. So let's go back to our middleware thing and finish this off. All right. All right, let's start our server. Cool, we see that custom middleware is a thing. So how, on line 15, how are we going to plug in our custom middleware? Just call it. Create a const middleware. Server.use custom middleware. All right, and we can just plug it in without a separate server use. So custom MW. Nice. Let's see if it works. Uh-oh, it crashed. So this is a really subtle point. Express.json, Helmet, and Morgan, these are all functions that return a function. So these things are all return a function. And it's a function that looks like this one. It has a rec-res and next. Custom middleware does, well, there are a couple issues actually. To start, custom middleware.gatekeeper is what we want. Let's start there. See if that works. All right, looking good. Gatekeeper called. Okay, this is what I was trying to say before. So let me back up. So custom middleware on its own won't work because this is an object. We're interested in the gatekeeper function specifically, but we don't need the parentheses. And that's a really subtle point. And the reason for that is that each of these are not actually middleware functions. They're functions that return functions. And the idea is because we want to be able to pass in customizations. So there's an extra layer on these because we can potentially customize them. Gatekeeper, we cannot customize. It just is what it is. So we actually do not need the parentheses. We would just pass it in as is. Let's confirm that it works. All right, we got refused. Let's try ferret. And it worked. Awesome. So not only have we just used our first bit of customized middleware, we have also figured out how to move it out into a different file so that we can keep our code nice and clean. A little preview of what's to come on Wednesday. And awesome. Someone just brought up the very next thing I was going to say, which is that I've structured this in a way where we could actually have a bunch of functions, right? This could be another rec-res next, and it does some stuff. That's, why did I do WH? Middleware. And then we could do module.exports equals gatekeeper is gatekeeper. Other middleware is equal to other. And we could have as many middleware files as we wanted in here. If there were enough, it might make sense to start to actually make this an entire folder that contains different files. So we can export a bunch of related items here together. All right, any questions? I see some typing. What is next actually doing? Next is saying go on to the next thing in the express train. So express is just like a bunch of different little, imagine express is kind of like if you're in a train car. I think there's this really wonderful, horrible movie called Snowpiercer that's in like a dystopian future where the only remaining bits of humanity are all on this crazy train. And it's like the whole movie is they just move from train car to train car and find like more and more disturbing things in each one. That's kind of like how Express works, except a lot less weird and dystopian. So you start out up here in express.json land, and keep in mind, this is what's happening behind the scenes is hidden from us, but it is just a function that has a rec, a res, and a next. So we're in here. This is like our first weird train car. And then we have to hit next in order to move to the next one. So somewhere in this code, next is called. So we go on to helmet. Next is called. And because next is a security, or helmet's a security thing, in some cases, maybe something would happen in helmet that actually does a res.send and boots us, in which case, actually, we probably should have Morgan first. But this might boot us. So it's like we're thrown off the train. We don't get to proceed. But if all is good, we'll hit next. We'll go into Morgan. Some logging will happen. Then next will run. We'll go into Gatekeeper. As we know, there's also opportunity in this bit of middleware to be booted. But otherwise, next is going to be called. Then we move on to this piece, which, remember what I said? This is actually technically middleware too. It's like the next train car. As we know, we'll probably be booted from this one because it's a route handler. So there should be a send that sends us on. But as long as we're not getting a response sent, next just allows us to move from function to function. So we gather and have different weird, surreal, futuristic experiences until we reach the end of our express train. So that's my extremely weird metaphor for how next works and how express works in general. Can I show, oh, I'm sorry, I just noticed there were several other questions that had escaped my attention. So we now have an Express server with no database. Exactly. So interesting servers usually have databases, but as we've seen in this example, you don't actually need one. You could just send back arbitrary messages if you want. A more realistic server is going to have a database. A server without a database isn't super useful. All right, next question. Can I show how to test it in the browser? Sure. So keep in mind, a browser is just a tool for sending GET requests. So I've done my localhost, my port number, the endpoint was entrance, and then because this gatekeeper expected a query string, I added a query string. As a reminder, the question mark queues, will queue express that we're starting our query string, then we do a key equals a value, and we could, with ampersands, put other, not sevens, ampersands, put other key value pairs on here if we wanted. All right, why are we inputting tiny into Morgan's call? It's just, there are different customizations. Let me see what, I think the default one is kind of awful. Let's see what it looks like. Yeah, so if we just do Morgan by itself, we get this really clunky, not that useful thing. So a lot of the times we like to just by default put tiny in here or put dev in here, which I now know color codes things. And these are just little options you can put in to make the logger a little more readable. How do we chain multiple query strings in the browser? I don't know about multiple query strings, but you can put multiple pairs on a single query string. So that would be, you use and ID equals 5 and there it's equal awesome and etc. Yet you would not want to actually pass a password through a query string. Very astute observation. So just doing this as a little toy example, when we get to authentication, which we will be exploring after the Christmas break, you guys will see how passwords, how tokens and passwords and all that actually are passed around, which is quite a bit more sophisticated, not too bad, but a little more sophisticated than a query string. All right, any other questions? All right, so let's talk about the homework for tonight. So the homework for tonight is a lot of the same stuff that you were working on last week. So I think the key goal in this homework is to really solidify the stuff you're already starting to learn, but there's a little bit of opportunity to practice what we learned tonight as well. So once again, this is going to be a week-long project, so you guys can start on it and get to a certain point tonight, and then we'll do more after the lecture on Wednesday. So I know it says due Wednesday and Thursday. My goal for you guys is to actually have the first part finished tonight. If you're struggling with it, or especially if you're all struggling with it, there will be some extra time tomorrow to work on it. But aim to have this first part finished tonight after the lecture. So actually a nice opportunity to talk a little bit about rest, or not rest. Yes, rest. So this resource idea. It's been hard to talk about resources because we've been building stuff with one resource, just users or just posts. Now we're going to have users and posts. So the idea is that each endpoint there should be endpoints that only deal with users and endpoints that only deal with posts. And there's a little bit of overlap because posts should have a user ID to connect them, but for the most part, we want to think about these things as separate resources with separate CRUD endpoints. So it's a little more complex because we're now balancing two resources. So the first thing, what does it want you to do tonight? I need to read this again, sorry. Endpoints. Okay, so the endpoints for managing users and middleware are due Wednesday, and the posts are due Thursday. So you're supposed to focus on the user endpoints tonight. So that is the one resource you focus on tonight, plus this middleware piece. And then you'll work on the posts on Wednesday. And I would try and, I know it's always fun to get ahead. I mean, if you want to get ahead, go ahead. But we will be learning some tools on Wednesday night that will help you manage writing CRUD endpoints for two different resources in a more clean, modularized way. So, yeah, it's pretty much just that CRUD type stuff you were doing, plus a custom bit of middleware that uppercases the user's name. So now we're writing a custom bit of middleware that's going to find the user's name from the request body and uppercase it. So you're mutating a piece of info that's coming in from our client. Apart from that, this will look very familiar. There's DB helpers on the module.exports. And then there is some implementation requirements. Notice that these requirements are less detailed than last time. That's because we want you, from your experience last week, to figure out what these CRUD endpoints should look like. So it's a little more challenging this time. But it does tell you the schema of what these users are supposed to look like. Okay, let's see. Any other questions? Oh, I see a couple other questions. How do we get a Git repository into GitHub? Oh, great question. I was going to talk about that and I forgot to. Thank you. So we could do git status and see that we have all these untracked files. So we can do git add all or git commits. Wrote some cool stuff. No, this is not a good example of a git commit message. But yes, more specific, really what we would have wanted to add and commit several times throughout this. And then you just push it up to GitHub. Is tonight's homework going to end up on our dashboard like Node Express? I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the dashboard thing is. Is that in GitHub or? I don't have a good answer for that. I don't know what's going on outside of my tiny little world. The student dashboard. I didn't even know there was a student dashboard. Learning things every day. Learned about front slashes. I would talk to your PMs about that. They probably know more about the dashboard than I do. As far as this, I don't think we created any GitHub repos at this point, so just push. I usually create them to start in GitHub, so let's see what happens. I think we might have to, yeah, okay. So we have to create, all right, I haven't done this in a minute. Should we figure it out together? Let's see. create get repo from command line. It's probably just going to say init, won't it? I think we want to add a, okay, let's see, push new repo to GitHub. Let's try that. There we go. So get remote add origin. And then do we have to, yeah. Okay, so we have to, you're good. So I think we would have to actually go to GitHub, create the repo, and then yeah, that makes sense. So I haven't used my GitHub in a really long time. Embarrassing. But yeah, so essentially you would go to your GitHub, you would add, you can also just completely originate your repo in GitHub, which is honestly usually how I would do it, but I was being lazy tonight and didn't want to mess with GitHub. But you could just create a new repo in GitHub, and so a new URL, and then use this command. I'll copy this. I'll just link this whole thing over if you guys want to mess with that. So then you would use this get remote add origin, and then you could do get push origin master. You guys are asking hard questions tonight. All right, any final questions before I let you guys go and work on your homework? All right, I think that is it for tonight. Good luck with your homework, and I will see you guys all on Wednesday. See you then. Bye.